Hold on, I got it. Okay, finishing up chapter 16, page 350, The Burdens of Bondage. Okay. Slavery was intolerably degrading to the victims. They were... Wait, hold on, let me... Sorry, I want to move my microphone so it's more comfortable. Okay. Slavery was intolerably degrading to the victims. They were deprived of the dignity and sense of responsibility that came from independence and the right to make choices. They were denied an education because reading brought ideas, and ideas brought discontent. Many states passed laws forbidding their instruction, and perhaps 9/10 of adult slaves at the beginning of the Civil War were totally illiterate. For all slaves, indeed for virtually all blacks, slave or free, the American dream of bettering one's lot through study and hard work was a cruel and empty mockery. Not surprisingly, victims of the peculiar institution devised countless ways to throw sand in its gears. When workers are not voluntarily hired and adequately compensated, they can hardly be expected to work with alacrity. Accordingly, slaves often slowed the pace of their labor to the barest minimum that would spare them the lash, thus fostering the myth of black laziness in the minds of whites. They filched food from the big house and pilfered other goods that had been produced or purchased by their labor. They sabotaged expensive equipment, stopping the work routine altogether until repairs were accomplished. Occasionally, they even poisoned their master's food. The slaves also universally pined for freedom. Many took to their heels as runaways, frequently in search of a separated family member. A black girl, asked if her mother was dead, replied, "Yes, sir, master, she is dead, but she's free." Others rebelled, though never successfully. In 1800, an armed insurrection led by a slave named Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia, was foiled by informers, and its leaders were hanged. DeMark Vesey, a free black, led another ill-fated rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1822. Also betrayed by informers, Vesey and more than 30 followers were publicly strung from the gallows. In 1831, the semi-literate Nat Turner, a visionary black preacher, led an uprising that slaughtered about 60 Virginians, mostly women and children. Reprisals were swift and bloody, and Nat Turner's rebellion was soon extinguished. An especially dramatic episode involved the enslaved Africans who rebelled aboard the Spanish slave ship Amistad in 1839. They seized command of the vessel off the coast of Cuba and attempted to sail back to Africa, but were driven ashore on Long Island. After 2 years of imprisonment and several trials, former President John Quincy Adams finally secured their freedom in a brilliant, moving argument before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1841, and the Africans returned to the British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. The dark taint of slavery also left its mark on whites. It fostered the brutality of the whip and the bloodhound and the branding iron. White Southerners increasingly lived in a state of imagined siege, surrounded by potentially rebellious blacks inflamed by abolitionist propaganda from the North. Their fears bolstered an intoxicating theory of biological racial superiority and turned the South into a reactionary backwater in an era of progress, one of the last bastions of slavery in the Western world. Defenders of slavery were forced to degrade themselves, along with their victims. As Booker T. Washington, a distinguished black leader and former slave, later observed, whites could not hold blacks in a ditch without getting down there with them. Early abolitionism. The inhumanity of the peculiar institution gradually caused anti-slavery societies to sprout forth. Abolitionist sentiment first stirred at the time of the Revolution, especially among Quakers. Because of the widespread loathing of blacks, some of the earliest abolitionist efforts focused on transporting blacks bodily back to Africa. The American Colonization Society was founded for this purpose in 1817, and in 1822 the Republic of Liberia, on the fever-stricken West African coast, was established for former slaves. Its capital, Monrovia, was named after President Monroe. After some 15,000 freed blacks were transported there over the next 4 decades, but most blacks had no wish to be transplanted into a strange civilization after having become partially Americanized. By 1860, virtually all Southern slaves were no longer Africans, but native-born African Americans, with their own distinctive history and culture. Yet the colonization idea appealed to some anti-slavery rights, including Abraham Lincoln, until the time of the Civil War. In the new 1830s, the abolitionist movement took on new energy and momentum, mounting to the proportions of a crusade. American abolitionists took heart in 1833 when their British counterparts, inspired by the redoubtable William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament and an evangelical Christian reformer whose family had been touched by the preaching of George Whitefield, unchained the slaves in the West Indies. Wilberforce University in Ohio, an African-American college that later sent many missionaries to Africa, is named for him. As with Wilberforce, the religious spirit of the Second Great Awakening now inflamed the hearts of many American abolitionists against the sin of slavery. Prominent among them was lanky, tousle-haired Theodore Dwight Weld, who had been evangelized by Charles Grandison Finney in New York's burned-over district in the 1820s. Self-educated and simple in manner and speech, Weld appealed with special power and directness to his rural audiences of untutored farmers. Spiritually inspired by Finney, Weld was materially aided by two wealthy and devout New York merchants, the brothers Arthur and Louis Tappan. In 1832, they paid his way to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was presided over by the formidable Lyman Beecher, father of a remarkable brood, including novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe, reformer Catherine Beecher, and preacher abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher. Expelled along with several other students in 1834 for organizing an 18-day debate on slavery, Weld and his fellow Lane rebels, full of the energy and idealism of youth, fanned out across the Old Northwest preaching the anti-slavery gospel. Humorless and deadly earnest, Weld also assembled a potent propaganda pamphlet, American Slavery as It Is. Its compelling arguments made it among the most effective abolitionist tracts and greatly influenced Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Radical abolitionism. On New Year's Day, 1831, a shattering abolitionist blast came from the bugle of William Lloyd Garrison, a mild-looking reformer of 26. The emotionally high-strung son of a drunken father and spiritual child of second-grade awakening, Garrison published in Boston the first issue of his militantly anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. With this mighty paper broadside, Garrison triggered a 30-year war of words and, in a sense, fired one of the opening barrages of the Civil War. Stern and uncompromising, Garrison nailed his colors to the masthead of his weekly. He proclaimed in strident tones that under no circumstances would he tolerate the poisonous weed of slavery, but would stamp it out at once, root and branch. I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Powerful. Other dedicated abolitionists rallied to Garrison's standard, and in 1833 they founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. Prominent among them was Wendell Phillips, a Boston patrician known as an abolitionist's golden trumpet. A man of strict principle, he would eat no cane sugar and wear no cotton cloth, since both were produced by Southern slaves. Black abolitionists distinguished themselves as living monuments to the cause of African American freedom. Their ranks included David Walker, whose incendiary appeal to the colored citizens of the world advocated a bloody end to white supremacy. Also noteworthy were Sojourner Truth, a freed black woman in New York who fought tirelessly for black emancipation and women's rights, and Martin Delany, one of the few black leaders to take seriously the notion of the mass recolonization of Africa. In 1859, he visited West Africa's Niger Valley seeking a suitable site for relocation. The greatest of the black abolitionists was Frederick Douglass. Escaping from bondage in 1838 at the age of 21, he was discovered by the abolitionists in 1841 when he gave a stunning impromptu speech at an anti-slavery meeting in Massachusetts. Thereafter, he lectured widely for the cause, despite frequent beatings and threats against his life. In 1845, he published his classic autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It depicted his remarkable origins as the son of a black slave woman and a white father, his struggle to learn to read and write, and his eventual escape to the North. Douglass was as flexibly practical as Garrison was stubbornly principled. Garrison often appeared to be more interested in his own righteousness than in the substance of the slavery evil itself. He repeatedly demanded that the virtuous North secede from the wicked South, yet he did not explain how the creation of an independent slave republic would bring an end to the damning crime of slavery. Renouncing politics on the 4th of July, 1854, he publicly burned a copy of the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, a phrase he borrowed from the Shaker condemnation of marriage. Critics, including some of his former supporters, charged that Garrison was cruelly probing the moral wound in America's underbelly, but offering no acceptable balm to ease the pain. Douglass, on the other hand, along with other abolitionists, increasingly looked to politics to end the blight of slavery. These political abolitionists backed the Liberty Party in 1840, the Free Soil Party in 1848, and eventually the Republican Party in the 1850s. In the end, most abolitionists, including even the pacifistic Garrison himself, followed the logic of their beliefs and supported a frightfully costly fratricidal war as a price of emancipation. High-minded and courageous, the abolitionists were men and women of good will in various colors who faced the cruel choice that people of good conscience in many ages have had thrust upon them. When is evil so enormous that it must be denounced, even at the risk of precipitating bloodshed and butchery? The South lashes back. Anti-slavery sentiment was not unknown in the South, and in the 1820s, slavery societies were more numerous south of the Mason-Dixon line than north of it. But after about 1830, the voice of white Southern abolitionism was silenced. In a last gap of Southern questioning of slavery, the Virginia legislature debated and eventually defeated various emancipation proposals in 1831 to 1832. That debate marked a turning point. There, after all, the Thereafter, all the slave states tightened their slave codes and moved to prohibit emancipation of any kind, voluntary or compensated. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 sent a wave of hysteria sweeping over the snowy cotton fields, and planters in growing numbers, recollecting the massive slave revolt that had erupted in Haiti in the 1790s, slept with pistols by their pillows. Although Garrison had no demonstrable connection with the Turner conspiracy, his liberator appeared at about the same time, and he was bitterly condemned as a terrorist and an inciter of murder. The state of Georgia offered $5,000 for his arrest and conviction. The nullification crisis of 1832 further implanted haunting fears in white Southern minds, conjuring up nightmares of black incendiaries and abolitionist there's devils. 358. Jailings, whippings, and lynchings now greeted rational efforts to discuss the slavery problem in the South. Pro-slavery whites responded by launching a massive defense of slavery as a positive good. In doing so, they forgot their own section's previous doubts about morality of the peculiar institution. Slavery, they claimed, was supported by the authority of the Bible and the wisdom of Aristotle. It was good for the Africans, who were lifted from the barbarism of the jungle and clothed with the blessings of Christian civilization. Slave masters strongly encouraged religion in the slave quarters. A catechism for blacks contained such passages as, "Who gave you a master and a mistress? God gave them to me. Who says that you must obey them? God says that I must." White apologists also claim that master-slave relationships really resembled those of a family. On many plantations, especially those of the Old South of Virginia and Maryland, this argument had a certain plausibility. A slave's tombstone bore this touching inscription: "John, a faithful servant and a true friend. Kindly and considerate, loyal and affectionate, the family he served honors him in death, but in life they gave him love, for he was one of them." Southern whites were quick to contrast the happy lot of their servants with that of the overworked northern wage slaves, including the sweated women and stunted children. The blacks mostly toiled in the fresh air and sunlight, not in dark and stuffy factories. They did not have to worry about slack times or unemployment, as did the hired hands of the North. Provided with a jail-like form of Social Security, they were cared for in sickness and old age, unlike northern workers, who were set adrift when they had outlived their usefulness. These curious pro-slavery arguments only widened the chasm between a backward-looking South and a forward-looking North, and indeed much of the rest of the Western world. The Southerners reacted defensively to the pressure of their own fears and bristled before the merciless nagging of the northern abolitionists. Increasingly, the white South turned it in upon itself and grew hotly intolerant of any embarrassing questions about the status of slavery. Regrettably, also, the controversy over free people endangered free speech in the entire country. Piles of petitions poured in upon Congress from anti-slavery reformers, and in 1836, sensitive Southerners drove through the House the so-called Gag Resolution. It required all such anti-slavery appeals to be tabled without debate. This attack on the right of petition aroused the sleeping lion in the aged ex-president, Representative John Quincy Adams, and he waged a successful 8-year fight for its repeal. Southern whites likewise resented the flooding of their mails with incendiary abolitionist literature. Even if blacks could not read, they could interpret the inflammatory drawings, such as those that showed masters knocking out slaves' teeth with clubs. In 1835, a mob in Charleston, South Carolina, looted the post office and burned a pile of abolitionist propaganda, capitulating to Southern pressures. The Washington government in 1835 ordered Southern postmasters to destroy abolitionist material and called on Southern state officials to arrest federal postmasters who did not comply. Such was freedom of the press as guaranteed by the Constitution. The abolitionist impact in the North. Abolitionists, especially the extreme Garrisonians, were for a long time unpopular in many parts of the North. Northerners had been brought up to revere the Constitution and to regard the clauses on slavery as a lasting bargain. The ideal of union, hammered home by the thundering eloquence of Daniel Webster and others, had taken deep root, and Garrison's wild talk of secession grated harshly on Northern ears. The North also had a heavy economic stake in Dixieland. By the late 1850s, Southern planters owed Northern bankers and other creditors about $300 million, and much of this immense sum would be lost, as in fact it later was, should the Union dissolve. New England textile mills were fed with cotton raised by the slaves, and a disrupted labor system might cut off this vital supply and bring unemployment. The Union during these critical years was partly bound together with cotton threads tied by lords of the loom in collaboration with the so-called lords of the lash. It was not surprising that a strong hostility developed in the North against the boat-rocking tactics of the radical anti-slavery rights. Repeated tongue lashings by the extreme abolitionists provoked many mob outbursts in the North, some led by respectable gentlemen. A gang of young toughs broke into Lewis Tappan's New York house in 1834 and demolished its interior while a crowd in the street cheered. In 1835, Garrison, with a rope tied around him, was dragged through the streets of Boston by the so-called broadcloth mob, but escaped almost miraculously. Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy of Alton, Illinois, not content to assail slavery, impugned the chastity of Catholic women. His printing press was destroyed 4 times, and in 1837 he was killed in a ferocious gun battle with an anti-abolitionist mob and became the martyr abolitionist. So unpopular were the anti-slavery zealots that ambitious politicians, like Lincoln, usually avoided the taint of Garrisonian abolition like the plague. Yet, by the 1850s, the abolitionist outcry had made a deep dent in the Northern mind. Many citizens had come to see the South as the land of the unfree and the home of the hateful institution. Few Northerners were prepared to abolish slavery outright, but a growing number, including Lincoln, opposed extending it to the Western territories. People of this stamp, commonly called Free Soilers, swelled their ranks as the Civil War approached. Okay. Wow, I guessed right. I said it would only take me 15 minutes, and it only took me 15 minutes. And now I gotta go do my stats homework. Okay.